In the spring of 1918, Britain was dying. Not from invasion, not from battle on the fields of France and Flanders, but from starvation. Slowly, methodically, invisibly, German submarines were strangling an empire. By April of that year, the gray wolves of the Kaiser's navy had sent more than 11 million tons of merchant shipping to the bottom of the sea. 15,000 merchant sailors lay drowned in the cold waters of the Atlantic, and in British ports, the shelves were growing bare. What followed would be called the finest feat of arms in the Great War. It would also be one of the bloodiest failures in Royal Navy history. This is the story of the raid on Zeebrugge. To understand what drove nearly 2,000 men to volunteer for what many believed would be certain death, we must first understand the terror that stalked the waters around Britain. The submarine, that strange and sinister invention, had transformed naval warfare. In April 1917 alone, German U-boats sent 860,000 tons of Allied shipping to the bottom. That is 13 ships every single day. One vessel torpedoed every 2 hours, around the clock, for an entire month. Britain, that island nation, imported 80% of its food, its cheese, its sugar, its grain. By spring of 1917, food stocks had dwindled to just 3 weeks' supply. Sugar reserves fell to 4 days' worth. In the industrial cities of the North, cases of scurvy appeared for the first time in generations. Compulsory rationing was introduced, something the British government had desperately wanted to avoid, fearing it would prove to the Germans that their strategy was working. It was working. Admiral Henning von Holzendorf, chief of the German Admiralty, had calculated with cold precision that sinking 600,000 tons of shipping per month for 6 months would force Britain to surrender before American forces could arrive in strength. He was very nearly correct. By 1918, the unrestricted submarine campaign threatened to achieve what the Kaiser's armies could not: total victory. And here is where geography became destiny. On the Belgian coast, Germany controlled 3 vital ports: Ostend, Zeebrugge, and the inland city of Bruges. These 3 locations formed a triangle of terror. Bruges served as the operational headquarters, connected to the sea by canals leading to both Zeebrugge and Ostend. From these Belgian harbors, nearly 50 German submarines operated, including the deadly UB-class attack boats and the UC-class mine layers. These Flanders flotillas were responsible for destroying 1/3 of all the ships sunk in the entire submarine campaign. 2,554 merchant vessels sent to the bottom by submarines operating from this single complex of ports. The location was devastatingly effective. The short distance from Zeebrugge to the vital shipping lanes of the English Channel meant German commanders could keep their boats at sea longer, hunting. Every troop transport carrying American soldiers to France had to pass through waters within easy striking distance of the Flanders bases. Every supply ship feeding the Allied armies. Every collier keeping the factories running. All of them vulnerable. If Bruges could be cut off from the sea, nearly 1/3 of Germany's submarine striking power would be eliminated at a stroke. It was a prize worth almost any cost, but the Belgian coast was a fortress. The Germans had spent 4 years fortifying these harbors. At Zeebrugge, the defenses were formidable beyond imagination. The Kaiser Wilhelm battery mounted 4 12-inch naval guns capable of hurling shells 23 miles. The Tirpitz battery added 4 more 11-inch weapons. Along the coastline, more than 200 pieces of heavy artillery stood ready. And dominating the harbor entrance itself was the Zeebrugge mole. The mole was a breakwater of extraordinary size, 1.5 miles long, curving in a great crescent around the harbor. Wide enough to carry railway tracks and heavy guns, fortified with concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and barbed wire. A garrison of more than 1,000 German troops defended its length. At its base, a steel viaduct 300 yards long connected the mole to the shore, allowing reinforcements and supplies to flow freely. Any ship attempting to enter the harbor would have to pass directly beneath the guns of the mole. It seemed impregnable. Previous British attempts to neutralize the Flanders ports had failed utterly. Bombardments from the sea proved ineffective against the massive concrete fortifications. The Germans simply repaired what little damage was done and resumed operations within days. Something else would be required. In January 1918, a new man took command of the Dover Patrol, the naval force responsible for controlling the English Channel. His name was Roger Keyes. He was 55 years old, stocky, pugnacious, and possessed of an almost reckless aggression that had marked his entire career. As a young commander during the Boxer Rebellion in China, Keyes had personally led a daring mission to capture 4 Chinese destroyers and had been among the first men over the walls of Peking to relieve the besieged diplomatic legations. At the Battle of Heligoland Bight in 1914, he had devised the successful British plan. During the Dardanelles campaign, he had grown frustrated by what he saw as excessive caution in his superiors. Keyes was not a man who accepted that something could not be done. Within weeks of taking command, he submitted a plan to the Admiralty. If the Zeebrugge mole could not be destroyed, perhaps it could be bypassed. Keyes proposed filling obsolete cruisers with concrete and scuttling them across the mouth of the Bruges Canal. If the block ships could be properly positioned, the canal would be sealed, and the entire German submarine base at Bruges would be rendered useless. The plan had been considered before and rejected as suicide. Keyes was undeterred. He requested and received permission to proceed. He was given, in his own words, an absolutely free hand to make his plans and select all the people who would carry them out. And carry them out, they would have to do under the very guns of the mole. The block ships could never survive long enough to reach the canal entrance unless the German defenders were distracted. Keyes proposed a diversionary assault directly onto the mole itself. While German gunners focused on repelling the attack, the block ships would slip past in the confusion and seal the canal. It was audacious, it was desperate, and it required men willing to storm a fortified position, knowing that most of them would not return. On the 23rd of February, 1918, a signal went out to the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow. Volunteers were sought to perform a hazardous service. No details of the mission were provided, only that it would be dangerous. Within hours, far more men had volunteered than could possibly be used. From one ship alone, more than 200 men stepped forward. Only 11 could be selected. The volunteers were assembled at HMS Hindustan, an elderly battleship at Chatham. They still did not know where they would be going or what they would be asked to do. They trained in sections, each group rehearsing their part of the operation without knowledge of the whole. Secrecy was paramount. If the Germans received any warning, the mission would end in disaster. HMS Vindictive, an obsolete cruiser from 1897, was transformed into an assault ship. 2,000 workers at Chatham Dockyard labored to prepare her for what lay ahead. 18 hinged gangways called brows were fitted along her port side, designed to allow troops to scale the 30-foot height of the mole parapet. Howitzers were mounted on her decks, Stokes mortars, Lewis guns, even primitive flamethrowers in sandbagged positions. A protected fighting top was constructed high on her foremast, bristling with pom-pom guns to suppress enemy fire from above. 2 Mersey ferries, the Iris and the Daffodil, were requisitioned and converted to carry additional assault troops. Their shallow drafts would allow them to operate safely in the mined waters of the harbor. The Daffodil was specially designated to push Vindictive against the mole and hold her there against the current while troops disembarked. 3 obsolete cruisers, Thetis, Intrepid, and Iphigenia, were selected as block ships. Their masts were removed and their hulls filled with concrete to make salvage difficult. Explosive charges were fitted to blow out their bottoms and send them to the seabed. Skeleton crews would sail them into the canal entrance, scuttle them, and then escape in small boats under enemy fire. And there was one more element. A pair of old submarines, C1 and C3, were packed with 5 tons of high explosive each. Their mission was to ram themselves into the viaduct connecting the mole to the shore and detonate, severing the German garrison from reinforcement. The submarine crews knew that if their means of escape failed and they were still in the water when the explosives detonated, the concussion alone would kill them instantly. Every man who volunteered for the submarines understood this. They volunteered anyway. By late March, the force was ready. Nearly 80 vessels would participate, carrying 1,700 men. The date was set for the night of April the 2nd. And then, as so often happens in war, the weather intervened. The operation depended absolutely on conditions being exactly right. A spring tide was required to give the block ships enough water to navigate the canal entrance. Darkness was essential for the approach, and most critically, the wind had to blow from the right direction. Keyes had devised an elaborate smokescreen system using chemical compounds that would create an artificial fog to blind the German gunners. If the wind shifted at the wrong moment, the entire fleet would be exposed. On April the 2nd, the force set out, 77 ships steaming toward the Belgian coast. And then the wind changed. Keyes had no choice but to abort. The ships returned to Dover. On April the 13th, they tried again. Again the weather turned against them. Again they were forced back. For the men aboard those ships, the waiting was perhaps worse than the fighting would be. Twice they had steeled themselves to face death. Twice they had been reprieved. Now they would have to find that courage a third time. April 23, 1918, St. George's Day, the patron saint of England. Keyes had deliberately chosen this date for its symbolism. If ever there was a moment for English courage, this was it. At dusk, the fleet assembled. Vice Admiral Keyes, aboard the destroyer Warwick, signaled to Vindictive using a hooded blinker light that would be invisible to the enemy. His message was brief: St. George for England. From Vindictive came the reply, from her captain, Alfred Carpenter. May we give the Dragon's Tail a damned good twist. Carpenter was 46 years old, a career naval officer who had served with distinction. He had worked alongside Keyes at the Admiralty and had been personally chosen to command the most dangerous ship in the fleet. He knew what awaited them on the mole. He had studied every photograph, every intelligence report, every scrap of information about the German defenses. He knew the mathematics of the thing. Many of the men standing on Vindictive's decks would not see the sunrise. As darkness fell, the fleet moved toward the Belgian coast. The coastal motorboats went first, laying the vital smokescreen. The artificial fog rolled toward the shore, blinding the German lookouts. Behind this chemical curtain, Vindictive and her consorts crept forward. And then, when they were less than half an hour from their objective, the wind changed. In the pre-dawn darkness, the smoke began to drift. Where moments before there had been impenetrable fog, gaps appeared. The German sound detection equipment, state-of-the-art devices developed to counter exactly this kind of attack, picked up the throb of approaching engines. Searchlights stabbed through the thinning haze. Star shells burst overhead, illuminating the sea in harsh white light. And then the guns began to fire. Vindictive emerged from what remained of the smokescreen approximately 200 yards from the mole. 200 yards from the muzzles of German artillery, machine guns, and rifles. Every gun that could bear opened fire simultaneously. In the words of one survivor, it was as if the gates of hell had opened. The cruiser was hit immediately, and again, and again. Shell after shell struck home. The carefully constructed gangways were shot to pieces. Of the 18 brows designed to land the assault troops, only 2 remained even partially functional. The forward flamethrowers were destroyed before they could be used. Men crowded on the decks were cut down before they could even reach the mole. The noise was beyond description, a continuous, thunderous roar, punctuated by the screams of the wounded and dying. In Vindictive's foretop, Sergeant Norman Finch of the Royal Marine Artillery manned the pom-pom guns alongside Lieutenant Charles Rigby. Their elevated position was dangerously exposed, but it was designed precisely to fire down onto the German defenders. As the cruiser was hit every few seconds, Finch and Rigby kept up continuous fire, switching rapidly between targets, suppressing the German gunners wherever they could. 2 heavy shells made direct hits on the foretop. The explosions killed Lieutenant Rigby instantly and killed or disabled every man in the position except Finch. The sergeant was severely wounded, bleeding from multiple wounds, alone in a shattered platform surrounded by the bodies of his comrades. He should have climbed down to safety. Instead, he dragged himself to a Lewis gun, got it working, and continued firing at the Germans on the mole. He kept firing until another direct hit destroyed what remained of the armament. Only then did Finch finally leave his post. He had saved countless lives below by keeping the German gunners' heads down. The current and the devastating war forced Vindictive to berth 300 yards beyond her intended landing point. This meant the assault troops would be that much farther from the German gun batteries they had been sent to neutralize. But there was no choice now. Daffodil pushed against Vindictive's side, holding her to the mole while the gangways crashed down. What followed was a nightmare. The assault troops had to climb across narrow, battered gangways while German machine guns swept them from multiple angles. Lieutenant Commander Arthur Harrison led the naval storming parties. Before Vindictive even touched the mole, a shell fragment struck Harrison in the head, breaking his jaw and knocking him unconscious. When he came to, bleeding heavily, in undoubted agony, he discovered that most of his men were already dead or wounded. A lesser man might have sought medical attention. Harrison gathered what remained of his force and led them onto the mole. The German guns had to be silenced. Harrison understood this. Without suppressing those batteries, the block ships had no chance of reaching the canal. He led his men across the bullet-swept open ground toward the enemy positions. They were fully exposed, charging directly into machine gun fire. Harrison was killed at the head of his men. All of them, every single one of the assault party that followed him, was either killed or wounded in that charge. Aboard the ferry Iris, conditions were worse still. The vessel had been designed to carry troops to reinforce the assault, but she could not make fast to the mole. The parapet was too high, the seas too rough, the grappling hooks unable to find purchase. For nearly an hour, Iris wallowed alongside the mole while German gunners poured fire into her. Her commander, Lieutenant Commander George Bradford, watched his men die without even being able to fight back. Bradford knew that if Iris could not secure herself, her assault troops would never land. He saw a derrick holding a heavy parapet anchor designed precisely for this purpose. Securing the ship was not his duty, it was not his responsibility, but someone had to do it. Bradford climbed the swaying derrick, while Iris surged up and down in the swell. The derrick crashed repeatedly against the mole. Timing his moment precisely, Bradford leaped with the anchor onto the parapet and managed to secure it in position. The instant the hook caught, German machine gunners who had been tracking his climb opened fire. Bradford was riddled with bullets. He fell into the sea between the mole and the ship and was never seen alive again. April the 23rd was his 31st birthday. While this carnage unfolded on the mole, the block ships were making their run. Thetis led the way, her skeleton crew fighting to keep her on course as shells smashed into her hull. She struck the underwater net barriers the Germans had strung across the harbor entrance. The nets fouled her propellers. Her engines, already damaged by shellfire, lost power. Taking on water, sinking, Thetis managed to coax one engine briefly back to life before her captain ordered the scuttling charges detonated. She went down in the outer harbor, 600 yards short of her planned position. But her sacrifice was not in vain. Her wreck had cleared a path through the net barrier for the ships that followed. Intrepid and Iphigenia pressed on. Their young commanders, Lieutenant Stuart Bonham Carter and Lieutenant Edward Billiard Leake, had watched Thetis sink ahead of them. They knew the Germans were now fully alerted. Every gun that could bear was firing at them. Billiard Leake was just 22 years old, selected for command at the last moment. He navigated his concrete-filled ship through the holocaust of fire and into the canal mouth. Both block ships reached the canal entrance. Both turned broadside and detonated their scuttling charges. They sank in roughly the positions planned, though not precisely where they needed to be for a complete seal. Motor launch, 282, commanded by Lieutenant Percy Dean, raced into the canal to rescue the block ship crews. Dean was 40 years old, a wealthy businessman who had joined the Naval Reserve out of patriotism despite a previous injury. He found the surviving crews gathered on the sinking hulks of their ships while German machine guns and artillery fired at point-blank range. Dean maneuvered his small craft alongside and embarked over 100 men. As he was pulling clear, his steering gear was shot away. He had to navigate by engines alone. And then someone shouted that an officer was still in the water. Dean was already clear. He had completed his mission. The sane thing to do was to continue his escape. Instead, he turned around and went back. 3 men were shot down at his side while he conned his boat back into the kill zone. He found the officer and pulled him aboard. Then, and only then, did he make his escape, steering so close under the mole that the German heavy guns could not depress enough to hit him. But the most extraordinary act of courage that night occurred at the viaduct. Submarine C3, commanded by 26-year-old Lieutenant Richard Sanford, carried 5 tons of amytal explosive in her bow. Her mission was to ram the viaduct and destroy it, cutting off the German garrison on the mole from reinforcement. The plan included an automatic gyro steering system that would allow the crew to abandon the submarine at a safe distance and let her complete the final approach on her own. Sanford chose not to use it. He understood that the automatic system might fail. The viaduct was a forest of steel pilings, and threading a submarine between them required precision. If C3 missed or struck at the wrong angle, the entire mission would fail. Sanford decided to steer manually, to remain at the helm until he was certain of success, even though this meant he and his crew would be dangerously close when 5 tons of high explosive detonated. In the darkness, under fire from German sentries who had spotted the submarine's approach, Sanford guided C3 between the viaduct piles at 9 knots. The bow lifted as it struck the mass of steel girders and stanchions. C3 was wedged firmly in place. Sanford lit the fuses. He and his crew of 5 scrambled into a small skiff. German rifles cracked from above. Sanford was hit twice, in the thigh and the hand. 2 other crew members were wounded. They rowed desperately, trying to put distance between themselves and the submarine before the timer ran out. At approximately 12:20 in the morning, C3 detonated. Witnesses described the explosion as a deafening blast that shook heaven and earth, the nearest approach to an earthquake one could imagine. A column of flame shot skyward. When the smoke cleared, a gap of 100 feet had been blown in the viaduct. The connection between the mole and the shore was severed. Sanford and his surviving crew were picked up by a picket boat commanded, remarkably, by his own brother Francis. Despite his wounds, Richard Sanford would recover and return to submarine service. He would receive the Victoria Cross from King George himself. He never saw the end of the war. On November the 23rd, 1918, 12 days after the armistice silenced the guns, Richard Douglas Sanford died of typhoid fever in a Yorkshire hospital. He was 27 years old. At 12:50 in the morning, the recall signal sounded. Daffodil's siren blared across the mole. The survivors, those who could still move, began fighting their way back to the ships. They carried their wounded with them. They left their dead behind. Aboard Vindictive, leading seaman William Childs found 19-year-old able seaman Albert Mackenzie crawling across the blood-soaked deck, shot in the back and foot, still clutching the remains of his Lewis gun. Childs lifted the wounded boy onto his back and carried him to safety. Mackenzie had been one of the youngest men on the mole. He had carried his heavy Lewis gun and 400 rounds of ammunition across the gangways under fire. He had fought his way forward alongside Harrison until his gun was shot from his hands. Then he had used the stock and pistol grip as a club, stunning an enemy soldier before finishing him with his pistol. He had picked up a rifle and bayonet and kept fighting. In his own words, pushing, kicking, and kneeing every German who got in the way. For his courage, able seaman Mackenzie would receive the Victoria Cross. He would receive it on crutches, still recovering from his wounds. He would be celebrated as the first London sailor to win the medal and the youngest man honored for the raid. He never recovered from those wounds. Still in hospital, Mackenzie contracted influenza during the great pandemic that was sweeping the world. He died on November the 3rd, 1918, 8 days before the armistice. He was 20 years old. As Vindictive pulled away from the mole, she was a floating charnel house. Her decks were slick with blood. Her superstructure was riddled with shell holes. 70 separate hits had been counted. Of the officers who had led the assault, most were dead or severely wounded. Among the dead was Wing Commander Frank Brock, the brilliant inventor who had designed the smokescreen system and had insisted on participating despite being too valuable to risk. He had gone ashore to examine captured German equipment and was last seen, according to witnesses, going single-handed for a gun's crew, armed with only a pistol and a cutlass. His body was never found. The fleet withdrew as dawn broke over the Belgian coast. Behind them the mole was scarred but intact. The German garrison, though shaken, was still in position, and in the canal entrance the 3 block ships lay on the bottom, their concrete-filled hulls partially blocking the channel. The cost had been terrible. 227 British sailors and Marines were dead. More than 350 were wounded. 49 were missing or captured. German casualties amounted to 8 dead and 16 wounded. The disparity in losses told a brutal truth about what had happened. This had been a forlorn hope, a desperate assault against prepared defenses by men who knew the odds and accepted them anyway. When Vice Admiral Keyes returned to Dover, he sent a signal to the Admiralty. He reported that the operation had been successfully carried out. The canal, he claimed, was blocked. The British public desperately wanted to believe him. After 4 years of grinding war, after the horrors of the Somme and Passchendaele, after months of bad news from the Western Front where the German spring offensive was still grinding forward, the nation needed a victory. And so the raid on Zeebrugge was celebrated as won. Winston Churchill, then serving as Minister of Munitions, declared it the finest feat of arms in the Great War. Newspapers across Britain trumpeted the success. The heroes of St. George's Day became national celebrities. 8 Victoria Crosses were awarded, the highest number for any single action of the entire war. 4 of these were chosen by ballot, the men themselves selecting from among their number who most deserved the honor. It was the last time the Victoria Cross would ever be awarded this way. Captain Alfred Carpenter received the Victoria Cross for his extraordinary coolness under fire. Walking the exposed decks of vindictive directing operations while bullets tore his clothing to shreds. Lieutenant Commander Harrison received his posthumously for leading that final fatal charge against the German guns. Lieutenant Commander Bradford received his for that leap onto the mole with the anchor, an act of absolute self-sacrifice that meant certain death. Lieutenant Sanford received his for steering C3 into the viaduct when a safer option was available. Able Seaman Mackenzie received his for fighting on despite terrible wounds. Captain Edward Bamford of the Royal Marines received his for leading his men ashore under impossible conditions. Sergeant Norman Finch received his for continuing to fire from his shattered, blood-soaked position in the foretop. And Lieutenant Percy Dean received his for turning back into the inferno to rescue one more man. The 2 Mersey ferries, Iris and Daffodil, were granted the prefix Royal by King George V himself. They would sail as Royal Iris and Royal Daffodil for the rest of their careers. But what had actually been achieved? The truth emerged slowly, and it was sobering. The block ships had not been sunk in optimal positions. Gaps remained through which vessels could pass. Within days, German engineers had dredged a channel through the silt near the sterns of the sunken cruisers. At high tide, U-boats could navigate past the wrecks with difficulty. Within 2 weeks, submarine traffic had resumed at nearly the pre-raid rate. By June, the Germans had constructed a wooden walkway across the gap in the viaduct, restoring communications to the mole. A simultaneous attack on Ostend had failed completely, the block ships there missing the harbor entrance entirely in the darkness. The canal would not be permanently blocked until June the 9th, and then not by any heroic raid but by a single lucky shell from a routine bombardment that struck and destroyed the lock gates. What 1,700 men and 80 ships had failed to accomplish, one stray round achieved by chance. Military historians have struggled ever since to assess the true significance of the Zeebrugge raid. From a purely operational standpoint, it must be judged a failure. The primary objective was not achieved. The submarine threat was not eliminated. The German defenses remained largely intact. British casualties were catastrophic compared to German losses. And yet something was achieved that night, something that cannot be measured in tonnage sunk or channels blocked. In the darkest spring of the war, when the German armies were advancing on Paris and the Allied cause seemed near collapse, a group of men had done something extraordinary. They had sailed directly into the guns of a fortress, knowing most would not return, because their country asked it of them. The 4th Battalion Royal Marine Light Infantry, which had been specially formed for the raid, was never reconstituted. The surviving Marines were dispersed to other units, but the battalion itself was allowed to pass into history as a mark of respect. The men who had charged across those gangways into German machine gun fire deserved, it was felt, to have their unit remain forever associated with what they had done. Today, a memorial stands at Zeebrugge churchyard. The names of the dead are carved in stone. In Dover, 59 graves in St. James's Cemetery form a special Zeebrugge plot. The bow of HMS Vindictive, salvaged after she was sunk as a block ship at Ostend in a second raid, stands as a memorial in that Belgian city. In towns across Britain, bronze plaques mark the birthplaces of the Victoria Cross recipients. And on St. George's Day each year, a few people still remember what happened on the Belgian coast in 1918. They remember Captain Alfred Carpenter, walking calmly through the carnage on Vindictive's deck, encouraging his men as German shells tore through the ship around him. They remember Lieutenant Commander Arthur Harrison, jaw shattered, leading his doomed charge because the guns had to be silenced and no one else was left to do it. They remember Lieutenant Commander George Bradford leaping onto the mole on his birthday, knowing the machine guns would find him before he reached the ground. They remember Lieutenant Richard Sanford choosing to steer his submarine into certain danger rather than trust an automatic system with a mission too important to fail. They remember able seaman Albert Mackenzie, a boy from a poor family in Bermondsey who fought with a gun, then a club, then a pistol, then a bayonet, until his body simply gave out. They remember Sergeant Norman Finch, bleeding and alone in a shattered fighting top, dragging himself to a gun and firing because there was still work to do. They remember Lieutenant Percy Dean, turning his little boat around because one more man was in the water. They remember all of them, the 227 who did not come home and the hundreds who returned broken in body or spirit. Men who sailed into the Dragon's Lair on St. George's Day and gave the Dragon's Tail a damned good twist after all. The raid on Zeebrugge did not end the submarine menace. It did not win the war. By most strategic measures, it accomplished little of lasting military value. But it demonstrated something that has no measure, that courage exists, that men will face certain death for each other and for their country, that even in the darkest hour of the longest war in memory, the capacity for extraordinary heroism had not been extinguished. 6 months later, the war ended. The U-boats returned to port and were surrendered to the Allies. The German Empire collapsed. The trenches fell silent. And in a naval hospital in Yorkshire, in the last days of that terrible year, a young submarine commander who had steered his boat into a viaduct and lived to receive the Victoria Cross from his king, finally succumbed to illness and slipped away. Richard Douglas Sanford was buried with full military honors. His medal is displayed today at the Britannia Royal Naval College in Dartmouth, where young officers still train for service in the Royal Navy. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Zeebrugge. Not a blocked canal or a neutralized port, but an example, a reminder of what ordinary men can do when extraordinary circumstances demand it. St. George for England, Admiral Keyes had signaled as his fleet approached the Belgian coast on that April night. "May we give the Dragon's Tail a damned good twist," Captain Carpenter had replied. They did. God help them, they did.